Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Thank you very much for joining us. So I'm Camilla Bullock. I have the pleasure of running the Emerging Payments Association Asia. And today we are delighted to have this workshop together with the Asia Pacific Financial Forum. So very soon hear from my colleague Julius Caesar Perennes. But before we dive into the discussion, I just wanted to have a little bit look at what we did within this stream of APFF and the work we're doing around open data last year. So at sort of August, we sent in our guiding principles to the ABAC, and they were discussed at that meeting. And JC will do a recap a little bit on that in just a second, what we talked about then. But I think it's important to see, first to say, open data or data is never a dull topic. It's actually where I was born in that industry. I used to work at Thomson Reuters and dealt with everything from low latency data to big data. And through the years, we just kept on calling it different things. So it's data management, intelligent data, big data, and now it's open data. And I have a feeling, especially this year, looking at what's happening around this discussion on AI and data, that the discussion is shifting a little bit again. And we're taking that into account, and specifically after the feedback that we got on the guiding principle last year. And they were endorsed and discussed at a meeting, but it was one person specifically put a hand up and said, what does this mean in the changing environment on geopolitical? Because we see this geopolitical altering or disruption, and a lot of the work that's been done over the last decades towards globalization is sort of retracting. And we see that this has prompted a lot of impact in the payments. We see more of localization of data system. We see more markets wanting to have more control over their infrastructure. And we're seeing the emergence of more and more privacy rules and data localizations. And this is something that comes up a lot in all of our topics. But it's meant that we're taking a step back to look really like, what are we talking about here? What is the role of open data, or how we use open data for innovation and how we help the global economy? Because if we're looking in general, what we want in the global economy and what we know is lifting markets up to prosperity's trade. And there is no trade without payments, and the payments is the movement of data. And when we're looking more and more into this, actually, data localization or privacy rule, where we can't use the data in our industry, it drives up the cost. And this is also a lot of the bottlenecks that we see being discussed in G20 when we're looking at enhancing payments, because the open data flow is not just there for innovation, but it's also to solve bottlenecks like fraud, AML, and CFTs. So with those inputs, we stepped into this year and the work we've done slightly differently. So we started to look at what role does data have and what role does data have in trade. And when we had our workshop in New Zealand, the first workshop we had this year, we looked a lot again on, structured data. How can we come to a standardization? But what are the bottlenecks towards that standardization? And we had one panel looking at privacy enhancing technology. How do we have to endorse new emerging technology like that to enable the open data? Things that we didn't really look at the beginning. And we also looked at different policies across our region and if they are further or limiting trade. So with that in mind, we're going to step into this conversation today. We've done some very, very loose draft guiding principles that we'll have a look at in a second. And we're going to host a discussion different from what we normally do. Normally, we do several panels where we hear from experts, but today we have some lead panelists that's going to have a round table in the middle of us, but everybody will then be welcome to chip in and ask questions to those. I think we have about 7 or 8. I won't call out the name because I don't know who's on the line yet, so we'll come to that in a second. So what I will start doing is, let's see, this is the agenda for today. And I'm at the point where I'm going to hand over to JC. So JC, please.
Yes, I think in the the revised program, we have opening remarks from Khun Komsak, who is the APFF chair. So maybe.
Fantastic. Sorry, this is me traveling between the regions, not having the last. Mr. Kobasak, if we could have a few words from you, that would be absolutely fantastic. Thank you very much, JC, for pointing that out.
Thank you, Kamla. Thank you, JC. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are. On behalf of the Asia Pacific Financial Forum, I'm pleased to welcome you all to the virtual workshop. Our topic today is of major importance to our region. We are in the middle of technological revolution that is rapidly changing the way we do things, a revolution that has been accelerated by COVID-19. Digitalization has enabled us, especially in the financial industry, to collect, store, and combine, analyze, and use massive amount of data. And this has been brought many benefits to consumer, business, and organization within and across the economies. The revolution has great potential to enable wider and more efficient across to finance for many individuals and small businesses. We have seen the benefit of digitalization and automation from the introduction of ATM to mobile banking. The next chapter of digital finance revolution has now arrived. And in this chapter, personal data occupy the central stage around which finance is being more closely integrated with other types of services. The name of this revolution is open data, which is an expanded version of open banking, involving a multi-directional flow of data across market participants. At this center is the individual consumer, which has full control of her or his data and ability to permit its sharing in order to more conveniently access a wide variety of services using digital channels. The properly designed open data system can promote competition, innovation, and better consumer outcome and help expand financial inclusion. We are now seeing many initiatives across the world to advance the revolution. A number of them driven by innovative firms with new business models, other by large technology players, several by banks, and other also by governments and regulators. Why this process is driven innovation forward? It also involves challenges, including privacy, consumer protection, fairness, and integrity and stability of financial system, among others. From a regional integration point of view, multiplicity of uncoordinated initiatives being undertaken pose the challenge of increasing fragmentation of our region into digital islands. For this reason, we recommend last year to APEC finance ministers that they encourage collaboration among financial industry, international organizations, and relevant public sector stakeholders to advance the development of open data systems. Consistent standards with domestic regulatory control and common guiding principles of open data for use across the region. This year, APFF, together with Emerging Payments Association Asia, is assisting the APEC Business Advisory Council in developing a proposal to APEC finance ministers for these common guiding principles. Our workshop today builds on an earlier one that was held in Auckland, New Zealand in February this year, from which we have been able to develop a foundational outline of these principles. In today's discussion, we hope to be able to draw on the contribution of experts to gain additional insights that would help us fresh up these principles. In closing, on behalf of the APFF, let me take this opportunity to thank our co-organizer, the Emerging Payments Association Asia, and our speakers, panelists, and moderators who are generously sharing their precious time with us to undertake this discussion. I also thank every one of you for joining us today. I wish us all a fruitful and successful workshop. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Mr. Kobasaka-san. I will then turn to JC to do a bit of the recap of where we are and what we've done so far in the working group. So JC, I will share your slides.
Well, thank you very much. So first of all, thanks to EPA Asia and Camila for hosting this discussion. So we think this is a very good opportunity to advance our work on developing guiding principles for development. So what I'm going to present are initial ideas that we have on what would be in those guiding principles. Next slide, please. So ABAC really is more of a strategic advisor to APEC. We do not have the technical expertise in specific parts of the financial sector, but so we rely a lot on subject matter experts, including those who are here today from EPA Asia. Fortunately, we have had a lot of collaboration with EPA Asia for many years now. We have various documents that we are able to use as sources for our suggestions. Starting from the survey that was conducted in 2019, we also had 2 roundtables last year. As mentioned by Camila, we had a workshop last February in Auckland. So we are using the various learnings from these discussions in order to propose some guiding principles. Next slide. So what we're proposing is actually looking at various areas. First of all, interoperability, the role of data, the governance and regulatory framework, the infrastructure, market development principles, and education and awareness raising. Next slide. So let me start with achieving domestic and international interoperability. There are 3 things that we are looking at here. The first is the need for a whole of economy approach, which would involve collaboration among relevant government and regulatory agencies, among industry sectors, and between the public sector and industry. And I think this is very basic because governments tend to be very siloed in their policy making. And this is something that is very difficult, posing a very difficult challenge for open data, because in the domestic context, you're actually looking at not just one sector, but having interoperability among different industry sectors, which are also currently, in most cases, being regulated by different government regulatory agencies. And so in order to develop consistent and congruent systems, it's very important for these to be coordinated. The second issue is whether a market-driven, regulator-driven, or a mixed model would work. Sorry, could you mute Adachi-san?
林さん、音が入ってるんでミュートにしてもらいます。
Thank you. So so that we also discussed that, and of course different strategies work for different economies depending on what kind of conditions they have at the outset. So we have some economies that have succeeded in moving forward with market-driven approaches. other economies were regulator driven and others have mixed approaches. We think that from our discussion, the mixed model has certain advantages because it allows both industry and governments to be effectively engaged in the process. And from experience, like for example, in the case of Brazil and Hong Kong, they were able to avoid the development of a fragmented ecosystem. The third issue here is international interoperability, which is at the heart of what we're doing in APEC. And that would require that each jurisdiction consider its international obligations in the development of their own open data systems. And it also requires collaboration among economies to domestically embed international standards into their own systems. And because these systems are evolving, to collaborate in developing them further, these standards underpinning the international payments ecosystem. Next slide. The second area is enabling trusted and secure sharing and use of data. So data is, of course, very important because we're talking about using customers' data in order for them to access more convenient services. And here, there are two things that came out of our discussions. The first is, of course, the importance of freer, trusted flow of data, which in our discussions, both in in Auckland, as well as the discussions we've had in our data ecosystems work stream in the APFF, would involve three things. One is for economies in the region to make use of a toolbox of legal and regulatory mechanisms that are already available to enable wider cross-border data flows. The second is agreement on common principles that can serve as foundation for a future international privacy framework. So for example, the recent principles that the OECD developed and published in 2021. And then the expanded adoption and use of emerging technologies, including privacy enhancing technologies that can enhance both privacy and security in digital payments. So these are critical to enabling consumers and businesses to benefit from open data systems. We also discussed the importance of proportionality or proportionate regulation, which is important in order to allow the sharing of a wider range of data sets and to increase the inclusiveness and benefits of open data and to reduce the risk of fraud. Next slide. Then we talked about the governance and regulatory framework. So what we've discussed so far are first, the importance of a centrally organized framework that would include standards, tools, policies, and regulations that can be effectively distributed throughout the market. Second is the importance of a balanced and flexible framework that provides room for evolution while maintaining constant communication with businesses. So this is a sort of a balance between too much regulation or too little regulation, which in both cases would not be very conducive to the development of open data systems. The third is the importance of international regulatory cooperation, especially in utilizing data that are available in different jurisdictions to combat crime and fraud and to strengthen AML and CTF efforts in a way that would reduce costs, that would encourage for innovation, and that would improve the inclusion and security of open data systems. And the fourth thing that we discussed is the importance of sectoral public-private collaboration, particularly in meeting high standards of transparency, which is important for providing the right incentives and regulations that can drive market competition, innovation, and connectivity. Next slide. The other thing that we discussed is the infrastructure. So we had some discussions about whether it is better to have a single API or whether it's important to adopt an API first approach. And the discussions we've had went into the direction of API first approach being more practical, because it would enable us to develop APIs that support the application and focus on the value they can deliver to business. And it will be useful in establishing market catered APIs for different sectors that fit each sector's market specifics and provide long-term benefits. We also talked about what would be a good starting point. And what came out in one of our discussions was the importance of using common identity and authorization framework built on a digital ID platform in order to reduce industry costs. And also we talked about the importance of the banking system, which is the most trusted custodian of customer data, as the infrastructure for data verification that we could rely on. So basically, we're saying that we don't need to build from scratch, but we can build on what is already there and develop further. Next slide. And then we also talked about some principles that would be important in market development. We talked about the importance of a customer-centric open data system. That's something that was especially highlighted during the workshop that we had in Auckland. Enabling innovation from all stakeholders through an efficient market environment. And we talked about the importance of purposefully unlocking data sets in order to achieve innovation efficiency and cross-border inclusion. And the next slide. This is something that we did not really discuss this year and the previous year, but which was highlighted in the survey in 2019, where a lot of the respondents to the survey felt that there is really a need for proactive education and transparent communication, which is very important if we want to lay the foundations for the development of open data systems, especially in developing economies. And so I think, given the fact that in APEC, there are many developing economies, this is something that we should include in the principles. So this is the last slide. And I think that this is still something that needs further work. And so, we really appreciate the inputs from this group in order to further develop these draft principles. So let me end with that. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, JC. And that sets the ground really well to take the step into the discussion. So I will invite Dr. Brad Pragnell as the moderator of today, and he's also the policy lead at EPA. So Brad, over to you.
Thank you very much, Camilla, and thank you very much, JC. Appreciate those opening comments, and I think that sets a very good groundwork. We have a bit of a panel here. And we're going to be working through just a few questions to get a bit of discussion going, and then we'll turn it to a bit of an open Q&A. So probably go for about 45, 50 minutes. Camilla, if that's sounds about right to you, and then we'll go to a Q&A. So I've got a few panelists down here. If I've got you incorrectly down as a panelist, then please accept my apologies. But I was going to just say everyone's name, and then if you could just take yourself off put yourself on camera, take yourself off mute, and introduce yourself briefly. Then I can go to the questions. So the first name I have is Lisa Beattie from Payments New Zealand.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thanks, Brad. I'm Lisa Beattie from Payments New Zealand. As Brad just said, I am the open banking lead for New Zealand, working for the API Centre, which is interestingly a division of Payments New Zealand. So while we do deliver the open banking data and payments framework, we do actually work within the payments domain. I do have a background in banking and agri-tech, actually, agriculture supply chains and commercialization of products. But here I am representing Payments New Zealand today.
Thank you very much, Lisa. And could I just ask people generally, if you're not speaking, could you please put it you're on mute, please? So thank you. The next name I have down here is Holly Dorber. Holly, could you come onto camera and take yourself off mute and introduce yourself?
Thank you, Brad. Hi, everybody. My name is Holly Dorber. I look after government relations for PayPal in Australia. I've been working with Camilla and the team at EPA Asia on this really important subject for at least the last year, I think, Camilla, and also sit on the board as Vice President of the Australian Services Roundtable, where we have a real keen interest in ensuring global cooperation around this issue of data flows to support Australia's services trade exports. So looking forward to being on the panel today.
Thank you very much, Holly. Next name I have is Jane Drake-Brockman. Jane? Are you there, Jane?
Sorry, I was having trouble unmuting. Brad, I'm in the category of someone who wasn't expecting to be formally on the panel because I'm not a subject matter expert in the financial system. If you want me to stay on as part of the panel, I will. I haven't prepared comments, but I'm very happy to engage. As I'm also a director with the Australian Services Roundtable, and on this topic, Holly is our definite subject matter expert. So it's up to you whether you want me to, but I would take, a lesser role.
Thank you very much, Jane. Someone else who may be in a similar category, I just wanted to make sure if you're on the panel or not, Paul Franklin.
I guess I am. So happy to be on the panel. I was for 3.5 years from early 2020 until about a week ago. I led the introduction of consumer data right at the ACCC in Australia. I'm no longer at the ACCC, so I'm here in my private capacity, but very happy to share any observations or comments I can.
Thank you, and great to see you again, Paul. And then lastly, Bob Troyan. Bob?
Hi, thanks so much, and greetings from the United States. I am Bob Trojan. I'm head of Token Insights, my advisory firm, and I am the Sherpa for the APAC data ecosystem workstream. So I'm delighted to be here.
Great, thank you very much, Bob. Much appreciated. So I might just start with Paul Franklin. So Paul, as you mentioned, you just recently left the ACCC. And I guess be interested in your observations in terms of the implementation of the consumer data right in Australia. So you had some senior responsibility for the implementation of the consumer data right within the Australian context. And just maybe some reflections you might have on that experience, and particularly if you could focus in on the respective roles played by the public and private sector, because I think that was one of the issues that JC raised in his presentation about finding that balance between the public and private. So maybe if you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So the consumer data right in Australia was a policy adopted I think in 2018, there was a review by Scott Farrell that outlined how it was to be implemented. And there was an important role for the ACCC to lead that implementation at the time that included setting rules and also, you know, the ACCC essentially has three roles now, which are to regulate the consumer data right ecosystem, which they do with the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner, to accredit data recipients so that any accredited data recipient has a right to access data from a designated data holder, and finally to be the registrar for the ecosystem. And that registrar function proved to be quite a significant technology component. So it involves building a register that contains encryption keys for each of the participants. And then over time, as we were not quite satisfied with the quality of solutions that were being implemented, the ACCC also took on the role of providing technology tools such as reference implementations of a data holder and a data recipient in the register. They released a sandbox. So there was sort of a facilitation role that the ACCC also performs, which is well beyond the traditional remit of a competition regulator. I guess comparing consumer data right to other regimes around the world, it was reasonably prescriptive in saying, in comparison to open banking in the UK, which began with the CMA 9 banks, the mandate for open banking in Australia was for all ADIs, 4 major banks first, with the other banks to follow 12 months later. We did have the added complication that we were going live just in the early days of the pandemic, which it did cause some serious disruption, particularly for the ability to access technology people. So it began in mid-2020 with the 4 major banks sharing their data and very small numbers of data recipients. Through 2021, the participation by the small banks grew to the point that probably early 2022, there was more or less ubiquitous data available from data holders. And I think now there's something like 76 banks and 113 brands, which is more than 99% of all the banking industry in Australia is making their data available. And it was really once ubiquitous data became available that it became a more attractive proposition to data recipients. So probably from the middle of last year, the number of data recipients has increased reasonably steadily. And we're now seeing a small but constant stream of activations of new data recipients and also new software products from various data recipients or their representatives. There's certainly been a need for very strong collaboration between government organisations and the private sector. There are several organisations involved. Treasury has a policy responsibility and they took on rulemaking from early 2021. There's an independent data standards body that sets the data standards, and that process is very consultative and engages the whole community. So the whole technology community, anyone with an interest in the operation of the consumer data right. I would say it's been certainly a significant challenge for the banks that were mandated to participate in the consumer data right. A lot of them have required very significant enhancements to their internal technology environments to be able to comply with their obligations. And that's been, I guess, one of the challenges, but also delivers a long-term benefit that there's ubiquitous data available. But I guess in setting a balance between whether it's a prescriptive model or a market-based model, the need for technology uplift that goes beyond just connecting, but also how do data holders manage their own internal technology environment is a really significant challenge.
Right. Thank you very much, Paul. We'll come back to some of the challenges in a little bit, because I want to explore a little bit on, what you think Australia did well and what you think maybe Australia could have done better. But I'll maybe just park that. I'll let you kind of muse on that a little bit while I go to a few of the other panelists. I might next go to Lisa Beattie. Lisa, maybe you can, for the group here, maybe you can explain a little bit about what Payments New Zealand is doing in terms of its open banking API work, and a little bit around what the role of the banking and payment sector can do in an economy in terms of trying to facilitate that and have more of an industry-led approach, and some of the learnings from that.
Yeah, so a quick, thanks, Brad. A quick overview. Payments New Zealand, I've kind of introduced that already. We do have the API Centre that sets up an industry-led open banking framework for New Zealand that brings data and payment or action initiation functionality together under the standards that we promote. Similar to what Paul just spoke about, we do go further into that implementation step around guidelines, ecosystem design, actor definitions, non-functional standards, education, that type of thing. We also work with industry on the roadmap around where the sort of best use cases, where you can derive the most value from. We have hundreds of contributors that inform our research on the roadmap as well. And I think that really, I'll bounce off that actually, because the real benefit here in being industry-led and rather than regulatory driven is in shaping something that is ultimately designed with the customer first, with usefulness first, and lands in a way that is with the investment that banks are making in their systems and the capital that's going into startups and whatnot. It's quite a trusting environment that we are building, and I think that's really important, that the banking and payments industries working together can have the ability to basically start these open data conversations from a place of experience, where the start line is or the communication is through experience and through examples. So as we all know, in banking and payments, we already have interoperable systems inside our domestic payment systems. We already work in the international space as well, using standards. We're already coordinated, showing how the different groups of actors can work together, and essentially the actors themselves can trust each other to design and prioritize and implement consistently in a coordinated way. So one example of what we're seeing in New Zealand about how this is really working and is opening open data conversations throughout New Zealand is we have, I've said already, hundreds of contributors in our community that are helping drive the roadmap and the design of our standards. And they are not just banking or payments sector. They extend out into agriculture, education, local government. And so we're already, as a starter for conversations about open data and the benefit, and as a kind of an open door into our regulator, we can demonstrate how the work of banking and the industry is driving outcomes for New Zealand. And that's a really good door opener to working collaboratively with the regulator as well.
Great, thank you very much, Lisa. I might just go to Holly. Quickly, Holly, in terms of the work that EPA Asia is doing, we're really looking at a way in which we can have a secure, efficient, and inclusive global payment sector that can effectively unlock economic growth and drive the digital economy. So, reflecting a little bit on the initiatives that have happened in Australia and New Zealand and looking what's happening globally, what do you think are the benefits for payments, both domestically, regionally, and globally, in terms of sort of driving this growth? I know there's a lot in there, but feel free to attack it any way you wish.
Yeah, stop me at any time if I'm getting off track. But thank you for the question, Brad. And actually, I think something that Camilla has been saying for a number of months now, it's really stuck in my mind when we think about what are we trying to achieve with these principles. And it's really about how are we collectively cross borders in multiple jurisdictions communicating the message that payments is really the movement of data, and that payments actually underpins, and this ability to make payments across borders actually underpins all of trade. There is no trade without payment in some way, shape or form. And so when we think about the domestic regimes to implement open banking and open data, and we talked a little bit about this at the New Zealand workshop, one of the challenges is that we've seen as these open banking data, open data frameworks have evolved, different domestic regulatory frameworks are sort of seeking to improve upon what came before it. And actually that's taking us away from consistency, complementary global frameworks, because everybody, it's almost like a fight to see who can have the very best open banking framework. And we're getting away from standardization and rather than toward cross-border standardization. And so what we're really trying to work towards, and it's a really difficult thing to do, because obviously each jurisdiction needs to have regulatory sovereignty, need to be able to set rules that work for their their domestic markets. But there is absolutely upside in financial inclusion, greater security in the global economy of having standards and consistency in the movement of data, and having the role for Emerging Payments Association Asia, and to an extent Jane's work with Australian Services Roundtable, is really those very beginning conversations with regulators and policymakers and trade bodies that connects the domestic language with the global trade opportunities, and who is making that case. And so when we've been thinking about this, we've been thinking about what these principles are that explains why it matters for all of these amazing innovations that are happening in data in domestic markets to work across borders, because that's where you really unlock the economic benefits, but also the social benefits, the financial inclusion benefits. You'll also harness the power of innovation cross borders and learning from other jurisdictions. And so that's really where I think when we think about this, it's really trying to narrow it down to practically, what does that look like? I've said a lot of like really high level macro things, but what does that look like in terms of a coordinated advocacy and communication campaign within the different spheres of influence that we each have, to really work towards complementary regulatory and data sharing frameworks rather than away from them. I hope that makes sense.
No, that does actually. Thank you, Holly. That's great. I might go to Bob now. So Bob, in terms of where EPA Asia is looking at, I mean, the role, the importance of global payment, of global standards in terms of underpinning the global payments ecosystem, and also of emerging technologies that can enhance privacy and security. Could you maybe talk a little bit about the role of standards and the role of emerging technologies in terms of driving efficiency, safety, and security, as well as privacy?
Sure, absolutely. Delighted to do so. And so I want to, kind of jump off of some of the points that Holly just mentioned, and so, and as Camilla was putting up. So, what are we trying to do here? We're trying to acknowledge that we're enabling secure, efficient, and inclusive. So secure. So, I can send funds to Camilla, and it's going to get there, and it's going to get there fast, and it's going to get there cheaply. And so doing it in a secure way, also, data security has the other side of that coin, which is data privacy. And those two are going to pull at one another in opposite directions. And that's where, what JC said at the very beginning, which is balance. And, we need to find the balance between those two. And, specific economies, New Zealand, Australia, the United States, others, are finding their domestic balance between those two. And how do we find that balance that crosses borders? And I think that's where global standards come in. Now, global standards can be helpful but they take a long time. And so they need to be private sector informed and public sector endorsed. You can do it the other way around, but my personal feeling is that ends you up someplace you don't want to be. So we've got this balance now that will be enhanced by the technologies you were referring. So we want secure, we want efficient, so it's low cost, and to end users, to people, but to use some of these technologies. At the last forum we had in New Zealand, which was, I guess, February, and that seems so long ago technologically, that we heard from companies, individuals that are using privacy enhancing technologies in the private sector. And those are hard and those are expensive and, take a lot of resources to do. And, you just don't use one, you use a lot. And so, two guiding principles of we want something that's efficient, again, we have these pulling the balance that we want to use the most, best, greatest technology, but that's expensive. And so how do we make that efficient too? And then finally, inclusive, and I would, usually when we're talking about inclusiveness, we're talking about financial inclusion. But I would say, is it, how do we include, folks who are usually excluded, refugees, people without, digital ID or any ID from a state. Now, really, I think it's evolving into, is it inclusive of people who don't have bank accounts? We've always been, bank centric, but, now we're talking about, I've been, involved in the last, 90 days, and I cannot tell you how many central bank digital currency conversations, which is, just another fancy way of really lot of syllables of saying payments. And so, I have to thank Facebook and Libra. I've never thanked Facebook for anything, but I'd like to thank Facebook and Libra for kicking off central bank digital currency in kind of a way to make everyone go, holy smokes, we got to do something. Now the Chinese have actually done something. So, with that, I think we're going to find that, with all the attention by sovereigns, by governments, by groups, by regions, looking at projects like Enbridge and Dunbar cross borders, that we're going to find some of these answers, Brad, that you were just asking about how do we find the balance with these different technologies being secure yet private. And I think from that we'll find the global standards. So over to you, Brad.
That's great. Thank you very much, Bob. That's excellent. I might throw to my reluctant panelist, Jane, just for a quick question, if that's okay. I'm not going to ask you a nerdy payments question. Thank you, but more of a general question. So one of the things we're looking for from EPA Asia is to try to get regulatory cooperation. So we definitely see there being benefits in regulatory cooperation in combating crime, fraud, strengthening anti-money laundering, counterterrorism financing. I'm not concerned about the content, but just wanted to get a sense, and you've been someone who's been very involved in sort of advocating for better coordinated approaches in Australia's place in the global economy. Where do you see things are at the moment in terms of regulatory cooperation? Do you think that we're facing some headwinds in terms of regionalization or national government sort of taking on a more protectionist role? So just sort of where are we in the cycle, I guess? I'm interested in your perspective on that.
Well, Brad, perhaps I'll just step back for a second and just explain that one of the perhaps the things I can add to this conversation also is that, as JC can testify, I'm a bit of an APEC junkie. I do know APEC very well. I do know ABAC very well, and I've been working with APEC since APEC 1. So, and in particular, what I focus on in APEC is the whole services sector. So the group on services, which has a services competitiveness roadmap with about 19 action items, one of which is financial services, and the word payments comes up in that context. And as typical of a big institution like APEC, a lot of work goes on in a lot of different silos. And even in ABAC, that's true, how you keep the financial thing on track with the digital task force and the trade and regional integration task force is always a challenge. So one of the things I'm interested to bring to this conversation, I'll come back to your specific question, is to help you focus a little bit on how in the APEC context to pursue what I'm hearing is what you want. And yes, you've asked the right question, because it is now pretty much accepted, I think, globally, that liberalization of trade in services is something that has to go hand in hand with regulatory cooperation. And there has been a very major recent development in the WTO, where we now have agreed principles, you can call them, on domestic regulation in the services sectors across all of them. It applies to all of the sectors. This work was spearheaded in APEC. It began with APEC's non-binding principles on domestic regulation in the services sectors. And it's been if we take a WTO perspective on it, it's been a 20-year project. If you take an APEC perspective on it, it happened incredibly quickly. Incredibly quickly, once APEC decided to do it, was a matter of 3 years. And, one of the last economies to join was the United States. But once they joined, they've utterly thrown their weight into it. So there are many examples in APEC where when the groundwork is done, it can come together very quickly. And I look at what and we are seeing in every FTA that everyone negotiates, we are now seeing those chapters in there called regulatory cooperation. They might not yet go very far, but they're there. Even with the EU, where Australia is nearing completion on its FTA with the EU, there will be a chapter on regulatory cooperation with one of the hardest places to do that, which is Brussels. So bottom line, the problem with regulatory cooperation is, where do you do it? You can't do it inside a trade liberalization or trade negotiating kind of forum. And we typically have not had, either in the region or globally, the right kinds of institutions. And you've seen decades of World Bank effort to try and talk about having a knowledge platform, which is a kind of underpinning base for regulators getting together. Well, it's very helpful in the APEC context to constantly point out that APEC has an absolute comparative advantage in being the region's regulator forum. But it has to get on with it.
Yep.
And it has to be helped into understanding what its agenda is. So one of the other big pushes at the moment in APEC is the new structural reform agenda. Structural reform is another word for regulatory reform. And their economies are beginning to focus more on the services sector. So what I would say is the time is right to have something that, I look at what happened last year, and you got APEC finance ministers to agree to that text and sent it back to the Asian Financial Forum to think about it more with stakeholders. Also, the question becomes, how long does ABAC want to take to come up with principles that it gets ministers to sign off on, and how is it going to shepherd that through the APEC institutional processes, which, and so I'm interested to try and work with you on that side of it, because I've watched a lot of APEC principles be drafted over the years. I mean, right now we're drafting the principles for logistics regulation. And there is a big, it's been very quick, and it's a big push to get it in front of trade ministers next week in Detroit. So I just think it's very important to focus the conversation on how would you operationalize anything you drafted? What is it that you really are seeking? And I've heard some remarks this morning that kind of work at odds with each other. Some people seem to think this is for the financial sector, but JC's slides talk about all industry, and we hear also about all consumers. Sometimes we get a sense of this is about each individual economy should apply certain principles, but the aim is interoperability. Sometimes I get a sense that what you actually want is a regional, to start with a regional thing and then work down. So I don't think there's clarity yet in the conversation about what it is you really want to achieve. You want regulators to get together, but where exactly?
Okay. Look, that's great, Jane. I actually might throw the question to Paul Franklin, because I see Paul on the, and I guess, I mean, my response, Jane, or my thinking was that, do we start with high-level principles and then try to apply that across industries, across economies, you know, and work our way down? Or is it kind of more of a technological bottom-up industry-led approach? So Paul, I'll throw this to you. You've lived the dream for the past few years with CDR, and you know, what is your take in terms of, you know, having been at the real coalface, in terms of, you know, what works, what doesn't work? You know, can we translate high-level principles down into, you know, into more finer points of detail with regulators, with industries, or do you need that bottom up? Like, give me your thoughts on that.
Both. You know, I think firstly it requires that both policy agencies and regulators, and it's an important distinction, but anyone in government who's involved in setting policy or designing ecosystems or setting regulatory parameters needs to be very actively engaged, I think, in both with the business community, but also with other regulators. And you know, that requires a significant outward facing effort, which is, you know, a bit different from the traditional role of a regulator, but I do think it's very helpful. In Australia, there are really firm expectations and rules about the way policy agencies and regulators engage with and consult with the regulated community. And I think it's really helpful when private sector stakeholders respond to those consultations to be able to refer to international forums where principles have been agreed, because, you know, having a set of you know, standards, principles, whatever, that has international backing is quite compelling, and it helps set expectations. I think the other thing too is we need to recognize that the data that exists in the economy right now is regionalized or localized within economies. And while it's helpful to move towards standardization, that's going to take time. In Australia, when the data standards body set out to define the standards that we'd use, they looked to the FAPI international standards, the financial API protocols. But there was no standard officially made, so they adopted FAPI 0.6. Eventually, when FAPI 1.0 was made, we made the transition to that standard, and we did that before expanding from banking into the energy sector. And I guess what that points to is this is not just a design once issue. There's going to be a need for ongoing evolution, revisions of standards. We know that FAPI 2.0 is coming, and we're expecting that that will need to be adopted before we move to action initiation through the consumer data right. Yeah, and that, I guess, means that whoever is facilitating the adoption of the ecosystem needs to prepare for an evolving ecosystem that will require ongoing standards updates and ongoing testing of implementation over time. And I guess, you know, an example of where that's relevant is where we're sharing transactional histories. Those transactional histories are based largely on older payment systems that are very localized. As the payments industry evolves to standards like ISO 20022, there's a need to uplift the standards to adopt those. So I think there is a potential to move over time towards more standardization. I also think it's really important to look at adjacent topic areas, things like digital identity. That was a gap that because we don't have a ubiquitous system of digital identity in Australia, before the rollout to banking, we relied on the bank's own unique identifier in combination with the one-time password. But that's an area where there's a need for an uplift of the data sharing process once there is a ubiquitous digital identity framework in place. So, you know, there is certainly a lot of engagement by regulators, in particular, between Australia and New Zealand. There's been a lot of discussions between the ACCC and the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner with our counterparts in New Zealand. But I think there's plenty of room for more.
Great. Thank you very much, Paul. I will go to Lisa in a second, but I might just go to Bob quickly. So Bob, if I can ask you, I mean, Jane sort of, you know, kind of put down a bit of a challenge for our industry in terms of, you know, what is the bigger purpose? What is the question we're trying to answer? And where should we start? So, you know, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, that's kind of more of a macro question, I guess.
Right, absolutely. And so, you know, I think, you know, we are starting, I think, in the right place. And, you know, we're starting kind of at the top. We're starting in the kind of big picture, you know, where do we want to go to, you know, setting of goals, and then challenge the private sector, the regulatory community to figure it out together. Now, you know, is that private sector led and regulator endorsed, or is that regulator led and private sector endorsed? I mean, I think there's a couple of different, you know, models there. And so, and you know, it may be, you know, different economy to economy. But, you know, I think, you know, if we can describe what we're trying to do, you know, what does it look like at the end? And, you know, I think that's in the, you know, in the what Camilla had put into chat, you know, that we're, you know, looking to, you know, have a, you know, secure, efficient, inclusive system. And then, you know, describing what that looks like to consumer, to a person. And I think to Jane's point, you know, are we talking about financial services or more broadly? I think that one thing I heard that, you know, I really love is what we've done over the past couple of years about, you know, talking about, you know, open data. I mean, talking that, you know, talk to a normal person about open data. or, you know, a regulator about open data, and they kind of look at you like you're saying something strange. But when you say, hey, you know, I want to talk about payments, and payments is data, and payments is trade. And so what we're talking about really is enabling fast trade, fast payments, and oh, by the way, that's called open data. I think that gets you a lot further than just kind of starting with the open data nomiker. So, you know, I think, you know, Jane has a good question of, you know, kind of where do we do this? You know, and I think, you know, we've been seeing some of that, the answer to that perhaps with some of the sharing in the central bank digital currency space, you know, central bank to central bank kind of cooperating and then bringing private sector in. I think, you know, there's some learnings there that we can use. And then how do, you know, regulators learn? One of the way they do is through things like regulatory tech sprints and those sorts of things that we've done kind of in the G20 sort of space. And you know, I can see doing more and more of those so that it is a mutual learning with the private sector and the central bank / regulators to get to the answer.
Great. That's great. Thank you so much, Bob. So I think, Jane, did you want to have a quick word? You're on mute.
I would like to come in just on this kind of threshold issue, because I agree with Bob that starting at the top and working down can be extremely important. It's never too soon to start, for precisely the reasons that Holly and Camilla both mentioned, and that is the fragmentation that's going on, the spaghetti bowl of different regulatory and you know, competing with each other to have the latest, newest thing. It's always important to get those principles in place. And I agree with Bob that there's not only one model, and finance has always been a bit different and done a bit differently from some of the other sectors. And we have even more good reason for that now, because apart from the ICT sector, it is the world's most digitalized sector. And that is not sufficiently often recognized, because all this work on digitalization goes on often somewhere else without it being constantly recognized that finance has more experience actually of what this process looks like than most other sectors. So I think there's another point I want to say about top-down principles, and that is that you can work towards improving them. They can be revised every X number of years. You start with something high level and you can end up with something operational down the track. But I think for the private sector, it needs to know what it ultimately wants, what it wants the regulatory framework to look like and not look like. Where does the consumer data right fit in the principles, for example? Which principle would address what kind of outcome is going to work best for innovation for the industry when regulators sit down to look at consumer data rights? So that's kind of what I mean by operational. It's important to think through the consequences of certain principles. I also think Bob is absolutely right that to just use the expression open data doesn't open a door with the public policy people. They think open data means open government data, and they've got very used to drafting provisions on open government data into trade agreements. So they need to understand that's not what industry is talking about. This is an offshoot from open banking, and it's driven quite differently. So I do actually agree with all of those comments. I feel that somewhere the principles need a home, an institutional home inside APEC, and you need champion economies that are going to pay for that technical assistance that JC said was so important. And that's why I'm emphasizing the institutional framework around where you want this to go.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. So thank you. That's very, I think there's some branding and positioning here that we need to work through that we get it right. I've might just open it up for questions or comments from the wider group. If you do have a question, could I ask that you use the raise hand feature? So at the reaction button at the bottom of your screen, if you have a question, could you please raise your hand? I'll give everyone a few seconds. Holly, you wanted to say something?
Brad, sorry, I just want to jump in before we open it up wider. And obviously, Paul, not asking for any, confidential regulator information, but I was interested particularly in your comment, and I think it's like a bit of a black box. When international regulators meet together and discuss things, I feel like it's helpful for us or informative to understand to what end. Is it just about sharing for domestic purposes, or because I think these principles can also help us with our domestic advocacy, so that the right people domestically are having the right conversations when there is that cross-market regulatory cooperation happening. I suppose how do you position, these types of principles, and to all the points we've just talked about, what's the practical outcome of those meetings? Is it to just share information for domestic purposes? And actually, should we be pushing to say that on all of these agendas, consideration should be given to cross-border trade issues and regulatory cooperation?
Sure. So I should, I guess, specify that the policy issues sit with Treasury and not with the ACCC. Information sharing is enormously valuable. Regulators have to understand the ecosystem that they're either regulating or proposing to regulate. And I've personally done a lot of engagement with regulators from around the world just to understand what's happening. So sometimes that's in forums like this, which are really useful, and sometimes that's in bilateral conversations. We would meet often with the open banking implementation entity. We've sometimes spoken, when I was at the ACCC, we'd speak to various regulators around the world just to find out what's happening, what have they learned, what can we learn from them. That's important. But I think, there is also a role for forums, as Jane said, for there being a home to own principles. And the more clarity there is about what is the role of various international organizations, I think that's helpful. Yeah, but I guess to answer your question, it's largely been about information sharing because the frameworks that we do have at the moment are largely local, but they're often informed by international norms. And that's sort of one form of one form of standardization is to do the same thing locally, or do things the same way. Another way is to formalize standardization so that everybody's signing up to the same regime, but that might take a certain amount of extra effort or letting go of local regulation, which is maybe it's useful, maybe it's not. That's probably a policy question I shouldn't stray into.
Yeah, I think that's really informative for us, actually, because I think it helps us then frame our domestic conversations, because then you can start talking about adequacy and cross-border recognition rather than saying we need one single regulatory framework. Actually, you start to get towards adequacy and recognition. I won't take any more time from the questions.
That's okay, but I might take the opportunity to make an observation I have made before. Having spent 25 years working in major banks and then moved into a regulator, I was really surprised by the reluctance of the private sector to engage with regulators. And there's a sort of I guess, a power imbalance, but At the Intersect conference last year, I made this comment that regulators are people too, and they love to know what's going on, and it's really helpful. So finding appropriate avenues to engage with regulators and with policy agencies I think that's a really effective thing for the private sector to do.
That's great. No, thank you, Paul. I think that's a very, very good observation. I've got a few people up here for questions. I might go to Lawrence White first.
Thanks very much. And apologies for the sun's just happening to shine. So hope you can see me okay. Look, firstly, I'm based in Melbourne, Australia, but I'm a consultant to the Institute for International Finance, and I've worked closely with Camilla in the past on payments and continue to work closely on cross-border payments. We've actually got a forum on cross-border payments coming up on the 12th and 13th of June. I just wanted to draw, well, firstly, to express strong support for the work of ABAC and APFF and EPA Asia on this topic. It's one that the IIF, the Institute of International Finance based in Washington, has published on and has been a strong supporter of for some years. Last year, we published a strategic economic cooperation framework paper, and we've published a number of papers on the idea of data free flow with trust. Earlier this year, we published another paper on the importance of data free flow with trust for anti-fraud systems and AML systems, and also another paper on RegTech impact. So we see, it's quite hard to quantify. I mean, there are economic models out there that try to quantify the GDP impacts of data localization policies, but it is quite a challenge. And so we've tried to focus our recent writings on qualitative descriptions of the kind of impacts and negative impacts that overly restrictive data policies have. So that's one point. Another is that we also published, and I'll put a link to that, the framework paper in the chat. Last year, we also published a set of principles for digital trust networks, which we hope to inform those who are designing and seeking to join digital trust networks. They're quite high-level principles. One of the annexes is on liability for participants of digital trust networks with 3 possible liability models. It does repay, I think, study for those designing these, because one of the huge challenges with open data and open data frameworks is when the liability picture is unclear, then the incentives for participation can be impaired, and there may be a lack of uptake as a result. So I guess the other thing just to mention briefly is the importance of data governance to all of this. And in a past life, until 2019, I worked at the FSB Secretariat in Basel, and I see Joy Wan on the line from one of our large card scheme members from MasterCard. So, and she was obviously at the Basel Committee and then the BIS Innovation Hub. Now, I mentioned the FSB because they did a lot of work on data governance around the UPI, the Unique Product Identifier, the LEI, the Legal Entity Identifier, and the UTI, the Unique Transaction Identifier, in the space originally of OTC derivatives. But the work is very instructive, I think, in a number of respects. And the key point is that really they tried to establish in the UPI work and the LEI work a sort of tripod where you have the regulators, the industry, and the standardization body all sort of feeding into the same high-level forum. So in that case, the LEI Regulatory Oversight Committee, or ROC, was established, but informed by formal links with the industry liaison group and also with the ISO in that case. So I think that model, and the other point of the model, which is very valuable, is the work the FSB did to firstly map out all the different functions that the ecosystem was meant to achieve, and then allocate and design bodies that would be the recipients of those functions. I think that's a really and very effective. I think that process, it did take an awfully long time. At some points, it was a bit like watching paint dry to be involved in the work, but it did come to a very solid outcome. And I think it's the kind of work that this body is could, if it had the appetite, take on the regional level. I think I've already made a plug for the forum. So members of the IF, including PayPal, MasterCard, and of the EPA Asia, are welcome to join the forum on the 12th and 13th of March, where we'll June, where we'll hear from CPMI, FSB, and a range of other speakers. So thanks. That's what I wanted to say. I'm happy to answer any questions around that, of course.
Great. Thank you very much, Lawrence. I've got JC with his hand up very patiently. So JC, did you want to have a question or comment?
Yeah, just some comments. So when I was looking at the document that EPA and ABAC developed in 2019, this was a survey of different economies in Asia. And I think what came out of that is really the great diversity that we have in the region. And then in our subsequent discussions, I think it was pointed out that there is no one size that fits all. Each jurisdiction will have to discover what it needs to do in order to have a system that works in the domestic context, including which agencies are involved, what is the preference in the economy, whether it's market driven, regulator driven, or mixed. So I think given that, it's unavoidable that we will need to have a bottom-up approach in the region. But that bottom-up approach needs to be coordinated in order for us to develop the ideas on how interoperability can be achieved. So coordinated bottom-up approach, I think, is something that is sort of the favored approach in APEC. This is what we've been doing in many other areas like trade. We've got the individual action plans, for liberalization, facilitation, etc. And we use APEC as a platform in order to provide coordination. The other question is, getting the right players. So I think we've talked a lot about the importance of getting regulators, getting industry, and I appreciate the recent comments by Lawrence that standard setters are also important in this conversation, especially because, as Paul pointed out earlier, these standards will have to evolve, over the years. And the incorporation of these new features in future standards will need to take into consideration the conditions in the different economies. And I think for Asia, which has been quite underrepresented in standard setting for most of the standards in the world, which has been dominated by Europe and North America, I think it's very important, for the economies in Asia. And then the, getting the right players, I think it will also take time because, from what I'm seeing right now, economies are still sorting out which players are, which institutions need to be involved. And even within institutions themselves, I'm aware, for example, discussions of CBDCs in central banks. There's still some discussion whether it's the international division or the payments division that will be in charge of it. That needs time, I think, to be sorted out. But that needs to be sorted out. And so that's why the importance of awareness of what are the issues is very important. And what we're doing here, the guidelines that we're trying to develop in order to provide guidance on, how do we actually develop open data systems that are interoperable in the region. And Jane, came out with a very difficult question. Is this where in APEC do we do that? Governments are siloed, but siloed siloed structures are more and more difficult to work with because we have more and more cross-cutting issues. So I think that also is something which we hope we could provide some guidance, in the recommendations that we develop.
Great, thank you very much, JC. I see Jane has her hand up, so Jane, I might just throw to you.
Well, I put my hand up, Brad, because right at the beginning you asked me a question which I didn't dare answer about protectionism. And I want to come back in and be a bit braver about making a comment or two on that issue, because I think that the interplay there between Paul and Holly actually gave us all of the ingredients that we need to understand what's going on here. Holly asked about, should it be one of the principles that regulators have to take the international dimension of what they do into account? And Paul largely saying that, well, they think they do a lot of that, but it is basically information sharing, or it's convergence of standards by following best practice somewhere else. And what I want to say is that, when we're trying to move from a toolkit of regulatory best practices that was developed in the traditional economy to one that's relevant to the digital economy, and by the time your industry has gone 100% online, as this industry has, then we're getting a lot of unintended consequences from regulation. And those unintended consequences, I'm not going to label them protectionist. I'm going to say, though, that they can be very trade distorting, and they're not deliberately protectionist, but there are a lot of unintended consequences from not taking the international dimensions into account, because regulatory arrangements can quickly become barriers to trade and barriers to local export competitiveness as well as import. And so I think actually that Holly has hit on quite a fundamental principle, which was always part of the toolkit, but it's really front and center now, really front and center in the digital economy. This paying attention, it should be part of the principles that regulators pay attention specifically to the international dimensions of because these regulations no longer, and Paul would know this from the ACCC work, even on competition and privacy, you can't, there is an interplay between the two issues in the way it impacts on your competitiveness offshore.
Great, thank you very much, Jane. I might just one person I might throw to, so Lisa Beattie, very quickly, as a bottom-up standard setting initiative in New Zealand, coming out of Payments New Zealand, private sector. Do you feel that you are plugged in to what's happening nationally or internationally? Do you feel you have enough connections into what's happening in the region, or do you feel that you're a little bit of an island? Yeah, quite literally, in terms of the work that you're doing, literally and figuratively. So if you can maybe talk a little bit about how you overcome and address those challenges.
Yeah, I thought I got away actually, Brad, without answering any more questions, because I've basically been sitting here just nodding, either internally or maybe you've seen my head nodding, because I do very much agreeing with what is coming out of the group here. But to the question, yes, we have been quite bottom up. We build the standards with the industry as a bottom up, and we don't have the regulator or the top down sort of New Zealand government driven outcome setting. But I do believe, and I think most people here have been saying this, in that a combination of both is the right way, and we acknowledge that in New Zealand, and we work with our regulator to ensure that we're open communication lines, so that when the regulation comes in, it is complementary to what we're building. We constantly using the sentence that regulation doesn't bring a market, so what we're trying to do is create that market that can go, has been proven globally to go too far in some instances where
if the market drives itself, people were sharing their passwords, you know, because there's a great outcome, great reason for sharing passwords, and that's what happens. So we want to create the market, want to create it as safe as possible, and we want to work with the regulator, and therefore there is opportunity for both the principles or the coordination being set, finding a home somewhere in a regulatory domain, and exactly what was being said around ensuring that all governments take that international lens. Now, your question to me was, do we feel like we're an island in that sense, or do I mean, I'm going to say we do our absolute best to be as connected as we can to what's going on in the rest of the world. We leverage a lot of what is happening in the UK primarily, and learn a lot from our colleagues in Australia who had quite a different, our cousins in Australia who had quite a different approach to the UK, and we try and learn from those. And rather than take a kind of a one-upping approach to be better than other jurisdictions, but finding a common medium, and to the point where we might even be criticised of being too slow or not doing enough. Certainly, there are some forward-thinking innovators in New Zealand who would say we want more, we want it faster, go harder, when actually we're taking a very slow and steady wins the race approach. And through that, we do find the commonality between Australia and the UK primarily. We apply it, we say we Kiwify it to some degree for New Zealand. And we follow I don't know if you're familiar with, more of a double diamond approach. We go broad and we use our industry to refine down, and we find those common factors, those common implementation features that are of value to the broadest base, but the smallest delivery scope to try and get traction. And so I really feel like that's a great learning for this. The principles will set the framework, finding a home from a regulatory point of view and setting those top-down approach, but then working with that representative key industry influence to determine where the transferable standards or feature sets that get off the ground first, where that gold is for the region to prove. And what we're doing in New Zealand is, like I've said before, is we're proving use cases, we're demonstrating value using what is, already a very digital, very coordinated sector in New Zealand, but demonstrating how that's applying to such a wide range of sectors in New Zealand. And I think it's really important that when you take that right balance of top down, bottom up, sector driven, but then, so create the market, complement it with regulation, you've really found that balance to start to see progress.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Lisa. You try to find that sweet spot in the middle between bottom down, top up, or top down, bottom up. Yeah.
And there's just one more thing. Sorry, Brad.
No,
just one more thing, in that somebody mentioned, maybe it was Jane, around doing it differently to how we've done it before. So the typically, I think working groups or industry groups were sitting within the regulatory environment, or they were sitting some siloed off. What we've done, which is a bit different for Payments New Zealand, is the API Centre has branched itself. Like, we're actually literally just a business unit of Payments New Zealand, but we've branded ourselves and separated ourselves in the sense that we are the API Centre, and some would think we were a company, in our own right, or an entity in our own right. And we're not really. We're breaking away from those norms and trying to make ourselves a lot more accessible in an external sense. And I think that's really key, is to start to not just think, is it just regulatory or just market driven? How do you establish a standard setting unit that sits somewhere in the middle?
That's great. Thank you, Lisa. Can I go to Paul Franklin?
Thanks. I actually wanted to endorse Lisa's comment about it being really important to facilitate a market. To that end, I think in determining regulatory settings, it's important to distinguish between rules that require and rules that permit. And there's an important role for a regulatory regime that permits things to be done with the market context. And sometimes, as a legitimate intervention, you can also require people, as we have on the data holder side in Australia. The rules require banks to make their data available. but I think, you know, there's a limit to how much you can keep compelling people to do things in a data economy like this. There has to be a willing exchange of data because there's some consumer benefit at the end of it.
Great. Excellent. Thank you very much, Paul. And then finally, I might go to Jane. Jane, sort of final words in the Q&A, and if you can keep it brief, because we're going to try to do a bit of a wrap up.
I just wanted to make a comment, Paul, about, I mean, are we going to move to looking at the principles themselves? Because if not, I wanted just to make a quick comment.
Please go ahead.
Okay, so because, you know, I've pointed out the one objective that I would have, and that is to insert into that text which has been circulated some of what's there in the conversation, but it's not there in the writing. The words unlock data sets, purposefully unlock data sets, for a policy person to come to that sentence without background in all of this conversation, that's really scary language. Purposefully unlock data sets could mean all sorts of things. And I wanted to suggest that you use that word that Julius Caesar put in there, proportionality. I mean, because that is part of the principle. It's like recognizing that every economy has its different public policy concerns, but that the principle should be something around regulation being proportional and preferably, if we could use language like least trade and investment distortive, or something even softer like recognize the international trade and investment dimensions to the regulatory outcomes.
Yes, no, that makes perfect sense. And I think you're right. I think we're going to take some of that away. Look at some of the language that JC has provided, look at the words we have. And I think you're right. We're going to have to be a little bit sharper on some of that language and think about the audience, right? Think about how the audience is going to consume some of that language. Look, that's been an amazing session. Thank you very much to all my panelists and commentators. It's been great. I might just hand back to Camilla now, if that's okay.
Yeah, thank you, Brad. And as I always do, I have you all expert on the line, and then I ponder, and I do ponder a lot. And ponder is that when you haven't really come up to what question am I asking, but I'm going to share some of my pondering. And this is almost coming back to that, what I said about like big data, what are we doing? And something that's come up a lot in white papers and podcasts that I'm listening about is this about insight. And I don't really know exactly how to nail it in something like this, but I think what we're looking, if taking Lisa's comment around actually making it a use case, this is something that came up in the workshop we had recently with the Financial Conduct Authority from UK, and how to create innovative policy is that find some use cases, show it first in a narrow line, show something that is really, really purposeful for lots of people. And I think that is what we're doing here, when we're talking about trade, and the G20 has already pointed out that we need to make it safer, secure, transparent, and fast. And we do know in our industry that that is the AML and the fraud. So binding that together with the policy, I'm just thinking now with privacy, I'm thinking, is it that we're looking for that insight to solve those use cases? Maybe it's not the full data sets we're after, because when we talk full data sets, it gets so scary, it gets straight into privacy. So what does the privacy enhancing technology do for that insight of yes or no, let it through or don't let it through? And also, just what JC said in the beginning, is that an education piece? And is the education piece about the use cases, that this is why we need open data? I'm totally not forgetting about innovation. That's a big piece of what we need open data for. But we have those painful things we can't solve for in cross-border payments, and cross-border payments is needed for trade. So is it an education piece also around this is what we're going to use it for? And then somehow talking about this, we're not after the data, we're after the insight. could we do it or could we not do it? So that's my ponder. So I'm hoping some bright minds around the table can take that away and see if we can add this to the text. Brad, I don't know if you have a comment straight away with your sharp mind that
Look, I think my pondering on it as well too is that you're right, and I think if you look at our industry and how we think of these things, we look at the data and we look at data in a very sort of abstract notion, and I think that and I'll take some of the comments from I think JC early on and from Jane, reflecting on how we sort of present some of this is about making it much more tangible. I think that ties in with your comments around insights and around the value that we deliver. So, and I mean, again, I know both Lisa and Paul raised that as well too, and Holly, it's about really around, where is that value going to come? And I think, getting really clearer and sharper around what the value is that we're delivering through this, more about as much about the why as it is about the how. We love the how, right? We love hows and what's in our industry. We're not necessarily always good at the why. So I think we need to think a little bit about the why as well, because that's where you create the persuasive argument for policymaking and decision makers. So yes, and I do see some comments there from Jane in the chat around education awareness raising. So yeah, making the why should I care? I've got 40, 50 different industry segments all coming at me with their concerns and things they want to do and things they think are important. Why is your thing more important than that other thing that I just was thinking about half an hour ago? So yeah, we're going to have to be really clear and crisp about that. And I think that's sort of the challenge for us in terms of how we develop that.
Good. We're almost on the dot of when we're going to close off 11:45, wherever you are in the world. JC, did you want to comment anything before we thank everybody who has participated today?
Yeah, so I think in terms of what are the next steps, so first of all, I'd like to thank everybody for their participation and their comments, because we've gotten a lot from these discussions. I think some of the things that were highlighted echoed some of the things that we have already included in our paper. So for example, the importance of consultative process, the need for or the challenge of the technology uplift for for financial institutions in order to to provide the the right infrastructure. It has to be customer driven, the importance of standardization and the fact that it takes time and there is an ongoing evolution of standards. Again, I think the discussions highlighted the importance of the key characteristics of an open data system, which is it has to be secure, it has to be efficient, and it has to be inclusive. We talked a lot about data security and privacy and the need for balance. And then we talked about the APEC environment, that it's very siloed, but also the importance of regulatory cooperation for APEC's ultimate goal of promoting trade in services and investment facilitation in the region. Getting the right players is a major problem there. We talked about the importance of bottom-up approach in order to address the diversity in the region, while there is a need for coordination in designing systems, getting the right players. We talked about the importance of data governance. I think there are some things that we need to further add in the text. For example, the importance of roadmaps, concrete roadmaps for each economy in order for us to understand what's going on. The importance of dealing with the silos in APEC, getting the right players. I think the importance of including standard setters in the conversation, in addition to regulators in the industry. I think it's also important to talk about the role of platforms in getting the private sector to engage with regulators. And then the importance of stressing proportionality. And I think one of the things that we need to expand further is the education part of it, especially how do we, how do we communicate the benefits through use cases, for example, is I think that we need to add. So there are a lot of things and a lot of other things that I probably haven't mentioned, but we hope that we'll be able to incorporate this into the draft, and we would like to encourage your comments. If you have any comments on, so we'll try to circulate the draft. We'd like to get your comments directly. If you could submit in terms of track changes, that will make it easy for us to do that. And if there are any additional insights that you would like to incorporate in the draft guiding principles, those would be most highly appreciated. So regarding the timeline, we are actually pressed for time because we need to get the guiding principles together with other recommendations from ABAC and other principles we're developing endorsed by ABAC by the end of July. But that means we need to circulate draft documents by the beginning of July. And for that, for these particular guiding principles, we would like to have a first draft by mid-June. So we'd appreciate your comments. If you could send us your comments, you could send us, especially if it's a direct comment on the document, you can suggest things to track changes. Then we'd appreciate that very much. So by mid-June, hopefully we'll have a first draft, and I'll circulate it, and I need EPA to help us circulate that for final comments. And hopefully by the end of June, the beginning of July, we'll have a draft that we can circulate to ABAC. And this draft will be annexed to the ABAC report to finance ministers, and that will become available to finance ministries, APEC officials, and once we've submitted to them, we'll also make it available generally to the public. So that's from our end. That's what we're planning to do. And at this point in closing, let me just thank Emerging Payments Association Asia, Camilla, especially, and her team, and Brad for helping us through this process. And I'll also wish to thank all the participants, especially the panelists who have contributed a lot of their insights into our discussions today. So once again, thank you all very much for being with us in today's workshop.